to Pradhan's Chakra talk. We are going to start today's session with an invocation of a prayer. So let me share the screen.
सच का दम भरे दूसरों के जैसे पहले खुद को जय करे हमको मन की शक्ति देना मन विजय करे
So, dear and respected friend, thank you so much for your kind attention and thank you so much for your presence. I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, on behalf of School of Humanities and Social Science of Raffles University, I welcome you. I also welcome you on behalf of SOHSS Chakra family, Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming. It's a great pleasure and indeed an honor to have available with us our distinguished speaker, Professor Daniel Raveh, esteemed professor from Department of Philosophy from Tel Aviv University, Israel. We are also joined by our respected discussants, Dr. Maroof, scholar and creative writer from Jammu and Kashmir. I welcome moderator of today's session, Professor Ananta Giri from Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai, and honorary executive trustee of this Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our chief patron, Honorable Dr. Justice Meena Vigombar, former Chief Justice of Rajasthan High Court, Professor Divakar Boli, President of Raffles University, and all the respected participants, viewers, listeners, both on Zoom platform and also Facebook platform. Let me give a brief introduction of our honorable speaker, Professor Daniel Raveh. Professor Daniel Raveh is Professor of Indian and Comparative Philosophy at Tel Aviv University. He is the author of 3 books exploring the Yoga Sutra, published in the year 2012, Sutras, Stories and Yoga Philosophy, published in 2016 from Rotterdam Press, and Daya, Krishna and 20th Century Indian Philosophy. He is co-editor of 2 collections of essays, Contrary Thinking, Selected Essay of Daya Krishna, and Making of Contemporary Indian Philosophy, Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya. His article appeared in numerous journals, including Journals of Indian Philosophy, East and West, Sophia, Journal of Indian Council of Philosophical Research, Journal of World Philosophy, Culture and Dialogue. Raveh also translated the Yoga Sutra into Hebrew language and English. I think Professor Raveh is one of the great authorities on Daya Krishna philosophy. Thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation. We are very grateful to you. Let me give a brief introduction to our SOHSS Chakra also. SOHSS Chakra, as you know, it is a circle of creative co-learning. It is an initiative of studying and learning together self, culture, and societies and the world. Friends associated with this are eager to work and mediate with new horizons of thinking and new movements of social and cultural change at work in our contemporary world. We study seekers such as Sri Aurobindo, Mahatma Gandhi, Chittaranjan Das, a seeker and creative thinker from Orissa, and many others around the world. We also present our own writing and reflect upon our creativity together. We also invite seekers from different fields of life to share with us their lives, vision, sadhana, and struggles for creating a world of beauty, dignity, and dialogue. We meet every Sunday or sometimes on Wednesday. Now we are nurturing this dialogue in collaboration with the School of Humanities and Social Science of Raffles University. Our dear and respected friend, as you know, Daya Krishna is one of the most critical philosopher in post-independent India. He devoted his life to questioning the given notion of reality, culture, literature, and aesthetics. It is very important to understand and locate the source of his creativity, philosophical insight. Let us try to explore these issues in some depth view. With this brief introduction, now I would like to invite Professor Anant Kumar Giri sir to kindly moderate today's session.
Thank you so much, dear Randhir, and a warm welcome to dear Daniel and Maroof and all friends co-presents in our satsang today, in our sambad, as Dayaji would say. In fact, Dayaji's nurturing of sambad, as Daniel very creatively writes, that it is not between Western philosophy or Indian philosophy. It is between two contemporary philosophical streams, and the participants are contemporary. And that is so significant. At the same time, as we are with the contemporary, so we can realize our participation this afternoon as also an humble sambad. And we are with our present, but being with our present at this moment, we are also invited to travel, to swim through different currents of time. And in his book, in the introduction, Daniel very creatively, presents Dayaji as a time traveler. And that is so significant. He is with the contemporary questions of politics and the philosophical predicament of modernity, but also he is with the Vedic and the Upanishadic. And that time travel is a new kind of hermeneutics, a new way of being with time, being with text and realities and realization, what we can call as multi-temporal hermeneutics. That is being at the present, but also being with many temporalities. And that calls for a journey with language, English, Sanskrit, Hindi, and our own languages. And what Daniel very creatively, tries to understand the significance of the Sambada project. And that project brought philosophers, trained in contemporary philosophy, not only Western philosophy. Because when Daya Krishna is present, is co-present in a dialogue like this, he is not just representing Western philosophy, he is also representing contemporary Indian philosophy and Pandits. And what Daniel writes is so inspiring. And here he builds on Sri Aurobindo, his secret to the Veda, and he writes, this meeting of these two rivers, goddesses, reveals a third goddess river, namely Saraswati. For Sri Aurobindo, Saraswati means sea of the stream, the flowing movement. Saraswati possesses and is the flood of the truth. Truth comes to us as a light, a voice, a compelling change of thought, imposing a new discernment of ourselves and all around us. So that living flow of thought. And here Daniel, in reflecting upon Dayaji's essay on thought, where Dayaji is making a distinction between thinking and thought, and that thought is living, in which we take part dynamically by questioning, but also with a humility of listening. Because when we are with Dayaji, it is not only that Dayaji is the perennial questioner, but he is also a listener. And therefore, Daniel's very creative, bringing of the practice and vision of hospitality. And that hospitality, that hospitality of not only nurturing the yajna of dialogue between different streams of thinking, but hospitality as a space of listening carefully, and that kind of allow, and being in Jaipur, Daniel brings this idea of alap, where we are listening to the music and listening to each other, is so significant. Now, in his book, in the introduction that Daniel has gifted us, he refers to Dayaji's many letters, and that is so helpful, because the sources of philosophy, or the field of the philosophical, is not only in the text that is written, but also in the letters. And that is also another domain of life philosophy, or living philosophy, so to say. Here, from Odisha, those of us who are acquainted with the work of Chittavai, Chittaranjan Das, and we know Chittavai wrote so many letters. So letter as a space of philosophical thinking, that is so significant. And while reading these letters, and Daniel, as as a living embodiment of the spirit of Dayaji, Daniel writes that in these letters there are many words which are written in quotation marks. For example, future, and many other words. And Daniel writes, quotation marks convey decades Dayaji's delicate handling of language. And that is so significant. And there are so many right words, but which words again to bring to our conversation, and that is so significant. And many other themes, Daniel refers to the whole predicament of colonization, that in which we are in, the way our thought is being colonized. And Dayaji's critique of that, and he refers to Levi-Strauss, the great philosopher, the great anthropologist, who was also a traveler. And he wrote a very important book called Triste Tropique, which depicts his way of being with the world. Now, the Levi-Straussian construction of anthropology, as Daniel very rightly points to, anthropology has moved much further. But Dayaji's critique of anthropology, and I think one of his essays called Anthropology is Bonded Science, I think Dayaji's critique of anthropology remained at that early level of anthropological journey. And in a conversation I had with Dayaji, in fact, Dayaji was presenting a lecture at National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, and in which I was also co-present. And I just posed this question to Dayaji, that while Levi-Strauss presented this idea, but in the same France, in Collège de France, now the holder of the chair of sociology, Pierre Bourdieu, for example, now his sociology and anthropology is very different from Levi-Strauss. So So therefore, one of the challenge in thinking about Dayaji is that as Dayaji asks questions, now what kind of questions we can ask to Dayaji? And therefore, as Daniel says for Dayaji, questions are perennial, answers are tentative. And this also we can cultivate, as we move along with our conversation with Daniel, that what kind of space for self-questioning and mutual questioning that Dayaji created in his alap, in his sambad, that has really nurtured and created a living, a philosopher like Daniel and many others. The other thought is that, and it is just an initial submission to warm us up, as Daniel very kindly invited us to think with his book, is that Daniel discusses the works of Ramachandra Gandhi, a friend and contemporary of Dayaji. But for example, some detailed conversation between Dayaji and J.N. Mohanty, for example, on thinking and philosophical sources, on phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, and Indian philosophical traditions. I have not read the whole book of Daniel, but this is something that we can think together further. Another another great contemporary Indian philosopher is Margaret Chatterjee. And what is so significant is that in his book, Daniel, in a border crossing sense, refers to many poets. She refers to the poetic work of a poet on fence. And Margaret Chatterjee is a unique philosopher who also wrote not only philosophy in a very deep sense, but also poetry. I wonder, what would be some of the paths of conversation between contemporaries like Dayaji and Margaret Chatterjee. The initial submission. It is my great joy to invite Daniel. And I just want to request that some of our friends are co-present from Odisha, and they would be enriched by a little bit of translation of your presentation. So with your generosity and friends, after you speak for 15 to 20 minutes, I will make a brief translation for 5 minutes or so. And we are very sorry that Professor R.C. Pradhan, so because of some time difficulty, he could not be present with us. And so with this, so Daniel, please.
Okay. Can you hear me properly? Ananta, can you hear me?
Yes.
Randhir, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can, yeah, okay. So first of all, thank you, Ananta, for this invitation. And thank you for the kind introduction. I'm tempted to say two things about your introduction before I begin. The first thing is that the book that I'm going to very briefly introduce to you is titled Daya, Krishna in 20th Century Indian Philosophy. And the book is not only on Dayaji's writings, especially his writings in his last decade. He passed away in 2007. So the last most prolific decade of his life, of his writing life, but also it introduces different interlocutors of Daya Krishna. And regarding the name that you mentioned, two names. You mentioned the Jitendranath Mohanty and you mentioned the Margaret Chatterjee. I hardly mention Mohanty, and by the way, I hardly mention Bimal Krishna Matilal. The reason is that they are quite known, that people read their writings. They don't, quote unquote, need me to introduce their work. Whereas other interlocutors of Daya Krishna, such as Mukund Lat, such as Yashdev Shalya, such as, paradoxically, Ramchandra Gandhi, Ramu Gandhi, everybody knows of Ramchandra Gandhi. Not many people know or read his last writings, especially his last book, Swaraj, from 2002. So I'm working as a facilitator. I'm trying to introduce to my readers contemporary Indian philosophers that they might not know very well. I would add to this that usually contemporary Indian philosophy is not discussed. I mean, either classical Indian philosophy is discussed from the Upanishads, Shankar, Nagarjuna, etc., or what we can call modern Indian philosophy, and especially figures like, of course, Mahatma Gandhi, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, but more quote unquote professional, academic, contemporary Indian philosophy is usually left out of the discourse, and this is the reason that I wrote this book. Regarding Margaret Chatterjee, besides her scholarship, her well-known scholarship on Gandhi, she's also the compiler, the editor of a volume, Ananta Must Be Remembering, titled Contemporary Indian Philosophy. And the first paper in this pioneering volume is one of Daya Krishna's papers. So very rightly you mentioned Margaret Chatterjee and of course Mohanty. Okay. So what I'm planning to do is to talk to you or to read to you something that I wrote for about half an hour, and I hope that after this we can have a discussion. Again, I'm thankful for this invitation, and I'm starting with two paragraphs from two letters mentioned by Ananta. Both letters are written to Dayaji's close friend, still alive, very much alive, Ramesh Chandra Shah, the author and the thinker based in Bhopal. And Dayaji writes to him in 2006, and in a second I'll also say something of the reason why I'm starting my book and also this short presentation with these letters. So in the first letter, Dayaji writes to Shah Sahab that very kindly allowed me to quote from these letters. So Dayaji writes to him, Ancestral Voices. Ancestral Voices is the name of a book written and published by Shah Sahab in 2006. So Dayaji writes, Ancestral Voices reached me a few days ago, just as I, along with others, with many others.
Sorry, Daniel, you are muted. Daniel,
Good.
you are muted.
Yes,
Okay.
Okay.
So you muted everyone and I was muted again. So until where did you hear the quote from the letters? I started to read Ancestral Voices reached me just as I was trying to close my eyes and to block my ears to the voices from the past in order to make room for voices from the future. This is what Dayaji writes to his friend Ramesh Chandra Shah. And he says that the voices from the future and everything with quote marks, the future, is inviting us and challenging us to think and to act in a new way. And then Dayaji writes, ancestors are all right, but one is to remember them only once a year during the Shraddha period and then forget them for the whole rest of the year. Their achievement is well known, as we shall not be what we are without them, but their failures are equally obvious, as we ourselves illustrate the failures in our life perpetually. And so did they, if the stories about them in the sacred texts themselves are to be believed. And after this introduction about the title of his friend's book, thank you for the book, but I'm not interested in Ancestral Voices, Dayaji writes, the next sentence says, still it is good to be reminded, and I look forward to reading what you have written on the subject. Two things. The first thing is Dayaji's perpetual plea to think anew, to do something new in philosophy, not to repeat everything that has been said so far. And as you know, as much as I know, most of the books under the category of philosophy are basically repeating things that were already said, and especially in the context of Indian philosophy. The wonder was Yajnavalkya in the Upanishads, right? And Shankara. Is there philosophy after Shankara? Or is everything just footnotes to the writings of the great minds of the past? So Dayaji was not thinking in these lines, I mean, I'm referring to Whitehead's famous saying that European philosophy is just a footnote, right, to Plato and to Aristotle. So Dayaji thought that we can do something, we can think ourselves, we can think independently. And as Ananta and I discussed a few days ago when we spoke on the phone, I think that this is one of the most important contributions of Dayaji. He was encouraging his colleagues, he was encouraging his students, and to some extent, everyone who wrote philosophy in India in the second half of the 20th century was Dayaji's student. So Dayaji gave his students, Dayaji gave everyone the courage to think anew. Not only the courage, the quote unquote, the permission to do something new in philosophy. I hope that you understand what I mean when I say everyone is Dayaji's a student, in the same sense that in the beginning of a sitar concert, the artist might say, I'm a student of Pandit Ravi Shankar, or I'm a student of Ustad Vilayat Khan, even if he never met them, even if he only listened to their music, you know, nowadays via YouTube or whatever, Spotify, still there is a sense of studentship, a sense of studentship, because these people, just like Daya Krishna, in the realm of thinking, gave inspiration and motivation to do something new. So this was the first part of the first letter that I wanted to read to you. The second letter is moving. Every time I look into it, I'm moved again. It's a letter written to Ramesh Chandra Shah again in 2006. Dayaji was very sick, was very ill, illness that finally he passed away from in 2007. And his friends, including Shah Sahab, wrote to him, very worried about his health. And Dayaji writes to his friend, and I think to us, he says, my dear Shah, and it's interesting, Ananta, to think of the addressing, the words of addressing, right? That Ramchandra Gandhi, Ramu Gandhi is calling our attention to. So the first letter, he starts, dear R.C. Shah. And now he starts, when we're talking about health, he starts, my dear Shah. I hope your worry about my illness is over. Though illness, and he writes illness in quote marks as usual, seems to be a natural, again in quote marks, a natural condition of life at all its stages and ages. The stranger problem is that there are not only diseases of life, or what may be called the body, but also of mind and reason and intellect, and even of the spirit. Mental illnesses are fairly well known, but not so the diseases which reason itself is prone to. As for the spiritual illnesses, one hardly hears about them. But what about imagination, Dayaji writes? Does it play an important role in diseases at all these levels? And if so, what is the quote-unquote cure for those diseases which are rooted in imagination and at another level in consciousness itself? If consciousness is a disease that has affected life, then could not life be considered a disease that has affected matter? Matter itself does not seem to have any diseases, though there is such a thing as rusting or radioactive decay, which in any case have not been seen as such, as disease. At one time, the story of the black hole seemed to suggest something analogous to what may be called disease at the heart of matter. But as Stephen Hawking has gone back on his earlier theory, as recently reported in the newspapers, we can hardly see them as such. You are a writer, Daya writes to Shah Sahab. Why not write on this? Is literature a disease of language, just as, according to Wittgenstein, philosophy is a disease which language suffers from when it takes holiday from its daily use? Imagine writing to you like this, but it is the person to whom the letter is written that provokes a thought current appropriate to him or her. So I think that what is striking about the second letter, the few lines that I read to you from the second letter, is that Daji is not concerned at all about his own disease. I mean, he's not afraid to die. He's not afraid of the disease. He takes the disease as an occasion, as an invitation to think about disease as such. And in this respect, we can say that for Daji, there is no difference, there is no gap, there is no firewall between quote unquote life and quote unquote philosophy. Philosophy and life are interlaced. Philosophy and life are part of one another. And the last lines that he's inviting his friends, the poet, the thinker, to think with him about the concept, the notion of illness, of disease. And in the last 2 years, in the last two COVID years, I was returning to this letter again and again. Can we think of COVID again in Dayaji's way as an occasion, as an invitation to think. Okay, so this is my introduction. Do you want to translate, Ananta?
Yes. Thank you for your generosity of thinking, dear Daniel. So, amaro bhai bhauni mane SOHSS आग्रही एवं उत्साह दीप्ता भाई भौणी माने आज आमे दया कृष्ण का संपर्क रे आलोचना करूछु। केवल दया कृष्ण का संपर्क रे आलोचना करू तांको सहित आज अपराह्न रे एई संध्या रे आमे भाबुछु तांको सहित बाट चालुछु। आ दया कृष्ण जने गभीर स्रष्टा साधक एवं प्रश्नकर्ता थिले एवं आमे जहा सब धरि नैछु आम भारतीय समाज विषय, संस्कृति विषय, दर्शन विषय से विषय से मूलभूत प्रश्न मान पचारि तेणु आपण माने एईटा नहीं दया कृष्ण के विषय अधिक पढ़िबे जानिबे। 1924 मसीह रे जन्म नैथिबा ए दार्शनिक आत्मा अनेक खोजिचंती, अनेक प्रश्न करिचंती। तांकर युव बयस रे प्राय 25 वर्ष विषय बयस रे सी दर्शन संपर्क रे व्हाट इज फिलॉसफी से जो बहीटी लिखिथिले तांकर पीएचडी थेसिस एक गभीर सृष्टि थिला। तेणु दया कृष्ण अनेक प्रश्न पचारिचंती तांकर दर्शन रे। गोटे मूलभूत प्रश्न होउछि जे आमे धरि नैथि जे भारतीय समाज आध्यात्मिक, किंतु ए आध्यात्मिकता भितरे दयाजी कहउचंती तांकर गोटे बही अछि क्लासिकल इंडियन फिलॉसफी ऑन मेन सोसाइटी एंड पॉलिटिक्स से कहउचंती आमे जो आत्मा कथा कहउछु जेमति याज्ञवल्क्य कहउचंती आत्मा, किंतु सेथिरे अन्यर स्थान कहउछि। याज्ञवल्क्य जेतबे कहउचंती आमे आत्मा को आत्मार कृत्यर्थता को अनुभव करिबा अन्य स्थान कहउछि। तेणु से मध्य कहउचंती जे भारतीय दर्शन रे आ समाज एवं राजनीति संगठन विषय बहुत कम आलोचना रही, बहुत कम सचेतनता रही। जोटा चित्त भाई जो भारतीय दर्शन समीक्षा चित्त भाई सब कहती जे भारतीय आध्यात्मिकतार दर्शन रे समस्त स्थान ना स्थान रही गोटे भारी उपर स्तर रे आम समस्ते आत्मा क्षेत्र में समान, किंतु आमर गोटे पीढ़ी रे गोटे भूमि रे समस्ते एकाही खाती, समस्ते एकाही भोजन करती। तेणु यही दया कृष्ण को संपर्क रे आमर बंधु डानियल गोटे बहीटे लिखिं से बही आज आम आलोचना करुचु। से आलोचना को आरंभ करी से कहउचंती जे दया कृष्ण कहूतिले ଯେ ଆମର ଯେଉଁ ସାମ୍ପ୍ରତିକ ଭାରତୀୟ ଦର୍ଶନ ସେଟା ଗୋଟେ ଚଳତ କ୍ରିୟା, ଧାରା, ସେଥିରେ ଗୋଟେ ଜୀବନ୍ତ ଦର୍ଶନ, ସେଇଥିରେ ସମସ୍ତେ ଭାଗ ନେଉଛନ୍ତି, କେତେ ପ୍ରଶ୍ନ କରୁଛନ୍ତି, କେତେ କଥା ଅନ୍ୱେଷଣ କରୁଛନ୍ତି। ଏଇଟା କେବଳ ବେଦ ଉପନିଷଦ ତାପରେ ଶଙ୍କର ଯାହା କହିଛନ୍ତି ତାର ଏକ ଫୁଟନୋଟ ନୁହେଁ, ତାର ଏକ କେବଳ ତାର ତା ତଳେ ଗୋଟେ ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ ଧାଡ଼ିଟିଏ ନୁହଁ। ଯେମିତି ପାଶ୍ଚାତ୍ୟ ଦର୍ଶନ ବିଷୟରେ ଆଲୋଚନା କଲାବେଳେ କୁହାଯାଏ, ଯେମିତି ହ୍ୱାଇଟ୍ ହେଡ୍ ବୋଲି ଜଣେ ବଡ଼ ଦାର୍ଶନିକ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ପାଶ୍ଚାତ୍ୟ ଦର୍ଶନରେ ଯାହା ସବୁ କିଛି କହିଛି ତା ପ୍ଲାଟୋ ଏବଂ ଆରିଷ୍ଟଟଲ ଯାହା କହିଛନ୍ତି ତାଙ୍କର ଏକ ଫୁଟନୋଟ। ଦୟା କହୁଛନ୍ତି ସେମିତି ନୁହଁ, ଦର୍ଶନ ସବୁ ଜାଗାରେ ଏକ ଚଳତ କ୍ରିୟା, ଗୋଟେ ଡାଇନାମିକ ପ୍ରସେସ। ଦ୍ୱିତୀୟ କଥାଟି, ଦୟାଜୀ ଯେଉଁ ସିଏ ଜୀବନରେ ଯେଉଁ ଦର୍ଶନକୁ ଅନୁଭବ କରିଛନ୍ତି, ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ କ୍ଷେତ୍ରରେ ତାଙ୍କର ବନ୍ଧୁ ରମେଶ ଚନ୍ଦ୍ର ଶାହା ଜଣେ ଜଣେ ଲେଖକ ଭୋପାଳରେ ତାଙ୍କୁ ଯେଉଁ 2ଟି ଚିଠି ଲେଖିଛନ୍ତି, ଦ୍ୱିତୀୟଟି ହେଉଛି ଯେଉଁ ଆମର ଯେଉଁ ଡିଜିଜ୍ ଉପରେ, ଆମର ଯେଉଁ ଦେହ ଖରାପ ହେଉଛି, ଆମର ଯେଉଁ ରୋଗ ବୈରାଗ୍ୟ ଉପରେ, ସେଥିରେ ମହତ୍ୱପୂର୍ଣ୍ଣ କଥାଟି କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେଉଁ ରୋଗ ବୈରାଗ୍ୟ ଯେଉଁ ହେଉଛି, ଆମର ଶରୀରର ରୋଗ ହେଲେ ଆମେ କହୁଛୁ, ମନର ରୋଗ ହେଲେ ବି ଆମେ କହୁଛୁ, କିନ୍ତୁ ଯେଉଁ ଆଧ୍ୟାତ୍ମିକ ଯେଉଁ ରୋଗ ଯାହାକୁ ସେ ସ୍ପିରିଚୁଆଲ ଡିଜିଜ୍ ବୋଲି କହୁଛନ୍ତି, ସେଇ ବିଷୟରେ ଆମେ ସଚେତନ। ପୁନଶ୍ଚ ଡାନିଏଲ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଦୟାଜୀଙ୍କ ଦେହ ଖରାପ ଥିଲା, କିନ୍ତୁ ତାଙ୍କ ଦେହ ଖରାପ ସମୟରେ ସେ ନିଜର ଆଉ ରୋଗ ଏବଂ ସ୍ୱାସ୍ଥ୍ୟ ବିଷୟରେ ସେ ଯେତିକି ସଚେତନ ନଥିଲେ, କିନ୍ତୁ ଦେହ ଖରାପର ଏଇ ଯେଉଁ ଅନୁଭବ, ସେ ଅନୁଭବକୁ ସେ ଏକ ଦାର୍ଶନିକ ଏବଂ ଗୋଟେ ଅନୁଭବର ଆଉ ଅନୁଭବ ହିସାବରେ ଗ୍ରହଣ କରି ସେଇ ବିଷୟରେ ଅଧିକ ସେ ଭାବିବାକୁ ଆରମ୍ଭ କଲେ। ତାର ଅର୍ଥ ହେଉଛି ଆମେ ଜୀବନରେ ଯେଉଁ ସବୁ ଅନୁଭବ ମଧ୍ୟ ଦେଇ ଯାଉଛୁ, ଦାରିଦ୍ର୍ୟ ଭିତରେ ଦେଇ ଯାଉଛୁ, ରୋଗ ଭିତରେ ଦେଇ ଯାଉଛୁ, ନିସଙ୍ଗତା ମଧ୍ୟ ଦେଇ ଯାଉଛୁ, କେତେ ପ୍ରକାର ବିଚ୍ଛିନ୍ନତା ମଧ୍ୟ ଦେଇ ଯାଉଛୁ, ତେଣୁ ସେଇ ଭିତରେ କେବଳ ନିଜର ସ୍ଥିତି ବିଷୟରେ ସବୁବେଳେ ବାନ୍ଧି ନ ଯାଇକି ଏଇ ସ୍ଥିତିଟା ପ୍ରକୃତରେ କ'ଣ, ରୋଗଟା ପ୍ରକୃତରେ କ'ଣ, ରୋଗ କେବଳ ଶରୀରର ରୋଗ ନୁହେଁ, ମନର ରୋଗ, ତା ସାଙ୍ଗରେ ଯେଉଁ ଆଧ୍ୟାତ୍ମିକ ରୋଗ ଯାହାକୁ ଆମେ ମା ଆଉ ଶ୍ରୀ ଅରବିନ୍ଦଙ୍କ ଭାଷାରେ ସାଇକିକ୍ ଇଲନେସ୍ ବୋଲି କହିପାରିବା। ତେଣୁ ଏମିତି କିଛି କଥା ଆମର ବନ୍ଧୁ ଡାନିଏଲ ଆମକୁ କହୁଛନ୍ତି। So now Daniel, please.
Thank you. Okay. So in my book, I'm trying to depict Daya Krishna's main projects, and I'm suggesting that Daya Krishna had 3 main projects, and the projects are: first, theorizing socially for India as a newly created nation state; second, what he called the Samvad project, and I will explain in a second; and third, the project of rereading classical texts anew. And this connects with the first letter that I read to you. What does it mean to read something anew? What does it mean to read something in an old way versus reading the same text anew? So theorizing socially for many, many years, the Samvad project, and finally rereading classical Indian texts. As an appendix to the portrayal of Dayaji as a man of 3 main projects, I also want to mention very briefly his first book, published in 1955. Actually, this was his PhD dissertation titled The Nature of Philosophy. I thought that Professor Pradhan would join us, and Professor Pradhan also wrote a book on Dayaji, which was published very recently, titled Daya Krishna's early philosophy. And Professor Pradhan discusses the nature of philosophy very elaborately. I hardly touch the nature of philosophy in my book. The reason is that for me, the nature of philosophy is a very interesting book historically, not philosophically. Daya Krishna in this so early work dares to criticize Western philosophy, European philosophy as he knew it. For me, the merit of the book, if we read it today, is that we can see how European philosophy was taught and how it was perceived in India in the 1950s. So for me, The Nature of Philosophy is a beautiful piece which belongs to the museum to the Museum of Ideas. And I would, as I suggested, I would treat it as an appendix to the three main projects. An appendix doesn't have to come at the end. I'm treating it as an appendix that comes before Daya Krishna's main corpus. So I would say a few things about each of the three projects, and let's start with theorizing socially for India. I'm going to read to you a few paragraphs from a piece that I wrote for Ananta, actually. And I referred to it as interpreter of maladies. Interpreter of maladies. And this is what I'm writing. Please listen. In his first series of lectures at Shimla in 1967, Dayaji gave two series of lectures in Shimla at the famous Indian Institute of Advanced Study. So the first series was in 1967, the second series was in 2005. And interestingly, in 2005, Dayaji was in dialogue with the much younger Dayaji of 1967. So we can see these two series of lectures as a dialogue between two Dayas, the young Daya and the older Daya. So in his first series of lectures, 1967, published in 1969, under the title Social Philosophy, Past and Future, Daya Krishna dedicates one of the lectures, which metamorphosed into chapter 2 of his book, to a comparison between what he refers to as, quote, the schematizations known as the Western and Indian cultures, unquote. His articulation is cautious, I'm writing, implying that in truth, there are many Wests in the West and many Indias under the title of India. Daya Krishna argues that the Western culture is characterized by a sociocentric predicament. This is his phrase, sociocentric predicament, which is a matter of, quote, viewing the human individual as having nothing in himself that he does not owe to the society, unquote. In this model, I quote him again, the individual is defined as a social animal. He achieves his humanity only through the social and cultural tradition in which he grows. As against the social-centric predicament, Daya Krishna speaks of a different predicament, which he refers to as Atman-centric, and which, according to him, finds its most persistent and effective exemplification in what is known as the Hindu civilization and culture. Here, again, I'm quoting, man is seen as a transcendent being. His sociality is only an accidental feature, which no more defines him than, say, his erect feature. He is the son of God, or perhaps God himself. Man is essentially asocial, or rather transsocial. The Hindu Atman-centric tradition devalues the realm of the social and the moral. Along with it goes the devaluation of the objective and the external. Now, these quotes of Dayaji correspond with one of his lifelong battles against the subordination by many of Indian philosophy to the spiritual quest. Now, Daya Krishna was not against the spiritual quest. He simply did not think that Indian philosophy is just a matter of this spiritual quest, as so many until today believe. Indian philosophy is moksha. Everything is subordinated to moksha. So Daya Krishna, how should I put it softly? Daya Krishna was not one of these. Yashdev Shalia, Daya Krishna's longtime Purva Pakshin, interlocutor, philosophical opponent, and a noteworthy contemporary Indian philosopher, takes issue with this dichotomous picture sketched by his friend, namely the West as sociocentric and India as Atman-centric. This intriguing debate takes place on the pages of the book, The Philosophy of Daya Krishna, that was published in 1996. Shalaji's main argument or counter-argument is that sociocentric and atmocentric features are prevalent both in India and in the West. He attempts to undo Daya Krishna's argument stitch by stitch. Daya Krishna, for instance, draws on Plato's Crito to illustrate the sociocentricity of the Greek culture and offers a standard reading of this text, according to which Socrates refuses to escape from prison to save his life out of respect for the law of the society that he is a member of and that this law represents. He does not wish to contribute to social chaos, Daya Krishna argues. Following Daya Krishna, Shalaji visits Plato. Now, it's interesting to see how these two titans work. So Dayaji is doing something and Shalaji is following his footsteps. And every text that Dayaji read and interpreted, now Shalaji reads and interprets in a different way. So you can think, if you wish, of Dayaji and Shalaji as the modern avatars of Shankaracharya and Ramanujacharya. Something like this, stitch by stitch, step by step. So I'm writing, following Daya Krishna, Shalaji visits Plato and offers a counter reading of the same text. According to Shalia, quote, Socrates believed his verdict to be based on untruth and the judges to be deluded. Therefore, Socrates is hardly respectful to the law that permits untruth and injustice. He rather wishes to change the law and the society that embraces such a law. To facilitate a social change, Shalia suggests he could have escaped from prison and propagate his position, upholding the value of self-preservation and the removal of error simultaneously. But he chose otherwise. Socrates' self-sacrifice, Shalaji writes, established him on the highest grounds of morality. The act of escape would have brought him down, if not to the lowest, at least to the common level. It would have deprived history of one of the greatest examples of a superhuman deed, unquote. A comparative philosopher, Shalaji reads Socrates vis-a-vis three Indian freedom fighters. Jayaprakash Narayan, Subhash Chandra Bose, and Mahatma Gandhi. All three did not feel any commitment to the law constructed by the alien British government. All three broke the law. The first two escaped from the British jail, but Gandhiji, as Shalaji refers to him, Gandhiji chose not to do so, thereby revealing the impropriety of that law. On a much deeper level, this is a quote from Shalaji, and at the same time, he was acting upon the Socratic principle that evil must not be returned by evil. Clearly, Shalaji concludes, and I quote him again, all this is not sociocentricity. He reads Socrates and Gandhi as committing self-sacrifice, not out of respect for law and society, but as an act of rebellion, which reveals a sense of elevated selfhood. Shalaji's move shows that the borderline between Daya Krishna's categories of sociocentricity and Atman-centricity is not always clear-cut as implied by Dayaji. Shalaji emphasizes the Atmanhood in Gandhi and Socrates. But for me, if I may interfere in this debate, for me, it is in fact implied by Shalaji's reading that self-sacrifice, despite the self in the phrase self-sacrifice, often has transformative social implications. This applies both to Socrates and to the Mahatma. Back in Shalaji's critique of Dayaji, he aims to further shake the foundations of Dayaji's move. I see both of them, Dayaji and Shalaji, as skilled chess players, and the chess game, the philosophical debate, as a platform to clarify Daya Krishna's position by providing examples for social centricity in classical Indian philosophy. Now counterexamples given by Shalaji to show that Indian philosophy is not, or Indian culture is not Atman-centric, but also sociocentric. The Indian concepts of Loka Sangraha, Mahajano, Yena Gataha, Sapantaha, and the three Rinas, Debts, Shalaji writes, are denotative of the important place of society in this value system. Loka Sangraha, as all of you would know, the ideal of action for the sake of all the world or every sentient beings, is expounded in Bhagavad Gita 3:20. The phrase Mahajano, etc., is extracted from the Yaksha Prashna episode of the Vana Parva of the Mahabharata. In reply to the question, what is the way? Yudhishthira says in David Schulman's translation, reasoning is without foundation. The sacred texts are at odds with one another. There is not even a single sage whose opinion could be considered authoritative. The truth about dharma is hidden in the cage. The way the great have gone, this is the path. However, I'm adding the phrase Mahajana can be understood not just as pertaining to great human figures, as in Schulman's translation, but also to a great number of people. Therefore, the text can also be rendered as implying that the path is the way taken by the many. In either case, it is the society, whether following its leaders or the path of the many, that paves the way. Shalaji's third example for social centricity in India is the Rena Traya, the three debts to the gods, the teachers, the rishis, and the ancestors, expounded, for instance, in the Taittiriya Sangita. The idea of debts or duties that the human person is expected to fulfill during his lifetime indeed roots him in a worldly, other-centered framework. To Daya Krishna's credit, it should be noted that in social philosophy, past and future, he himself offers counterexamples to his general claim, sociocentricity in the West, Atman-centricity in India. But for him, these are exceptions that prove the rule. Like Shalya, Daya Krishna mentions the debts, but a staunch pluralist and a perennial rebel, he refuses to confine himself to just three arenas, three duties. The moral realm, he explains, is constituted, I'm quoting him, by the notion of debt or the owing of an obligation to others. The others in the Hindu tradition include not only persons, but ancestors, gods, plants, animals, earth, sky, and so forth. Our debts in the plural are not just to ancestors, teachers, and gods. We are indebted to the whole world. Numerous factors and people enable me to sit here right now at the Gilman building of Tel Aviv University and speak to you. According to Daya Krishna, we are indebted to all of these. Daya Krishna offers another counterexample to his own initial dichotomist position. For instance, the other-centered Hindu ideal of the avatar and the parallel Buddhist idea of the bodhisattva. He admits that these are, quote, obvious exceptions to what we have been trying to characterize as the Atman-centric tradition of India. But he confirms his basic contention and adds that. Now listen. Atman-centricity leads a people's attention away from the active concern with society and its betterment. When a society's best brains are concerned with the pursuit of something which is essentially asocial or transsocial, and which requires an active withdrawal from the institutions that sustain it, then the road is prepared for the inevitable takeover, either by those who are interested in their own gain or by those who are bent on transforming the world in the image of their own good. The immoralists from within and the messiahs from without rule the social realm alternately after the Atman centricists have withdrawn into their own pursuit of trans-social reality, unquote. These lines, I'm closing this point in a second, and then I will invite Ananta to translate. These lines convey Daya Krishna's worry and concern. He pleads for social betterment and criticizes the lack of interest in the social domain that he sees around him in the name of spirituality, which allows immoral elements, as he puts it, motivated by egotistic considerations, to take over. We need you, he appeals to the society's best brains. But speaking of morality, we can assume that his plea is also directed to those with heart and empathy. Do not aspire for the beyond. Show solidarity. Remain here and contribute socially, politically. In his 2005 Shimla lectures, the second series of lectures, Dayaji returns to this point from the first series of lectures. He continues from where he stopped almost 4 decades earlier. When I talk to people, he tells his audience, they seem to be unaware of what is going on. They know something of what economics is doing, they know something of what politics is doing, but they do not believe in the reality of politics, of economics. For them, these realms are unreal or belong merely to the Vyavahara, the worldly realm. His critique again is that people are willing to give up everything worldly for the sake of the so-called spiritual. He feels that his listeners, or at least many of them, are in love with Atman, Brahman, Moksha, and do not wish to get their hands dirty, so to say, with politics, budgets, interests, and agenda. But in a paraphrase of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's famous maxim from the Jewish Mishnah, from the Jewish scriptures, if there is no flower, there is no Brahman. If there is no flower, there is no Brahman. This is Dayaji's claim. From Shimla to Shimla, from the first series of lectures to the second series of lectures, I read Daya Krishna as an interpreter of maladies, if I may borrow this beautiful phrase from Jhumpa Lahiri. According to him, beatific ideals, moksha, Brahman, Atman, can become social hurdles. If traditionally the Vyavahara, the worldliness, is seen as a disease, apropos what we said about disease in the beginning, which needs to be cured, then Daya Krishna turns the tables and dares to defer. For him, neglect of the world, of the external reality, is the malady that the Indian civilization suffers from, and which needs cure. Therefore, Shalaji's critique of Daya Krishna, interesting as its details are, and it is really interesting. For instance, a Gandhian Socrates and the Socratic Gandhi misses the point. Daya Krishna is the last thinker to identify India with spirituality or beyondness. For him, this is a very partial picture. For him, the notion of the Atman makes sense only in relation to the now and here. Otherwise, it is an obstacle. For him, the ideal of freedom is totally empty if it applies merely to transworldly realism, to transworldly reality, and associates withdrawal without return. Okay, I'm stopping here and inviting Ananta to rise.
Thank you, Daniel. Now, Randhir, you can again unmute my video if possible. Okay. So, dear friends, I realize some of our non-ODF friends are asking that what is the language. I request your generosity. We have some participants who are enriched by a little bit of translation of this into Odia. So very quickly ଆମର ଭାଇ ଭଉଣୀ ମାନେ ଏଇ ପର୍ବରେ ଆମର ଡାନିଏଲ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଦୟାଜୀଙ୍କର ଯୋଉ ଦର୍ଶନ ସେଥିରେ ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଆମର ଯୋଉ ସମାଜ ବିଷୟରେ ଭାବିବାର କଥାଟି ସେଇଟା ଭାରତୀୟ ଦର୍ଶନରେ ସମାଜ ବିଷୟରେ ବେଶୀ କିଛି ଭାବା ଯାଏନି, ଆତ୍ମ ବିଷୟରେ ଭାବା ଯାଇଛି। ତେଣୁ ଦର୍ଶନ ଭିତରେ ଆଉ ଭାରତ ଏବଂ ପାଶ୍ଚାତ୍ୟ ଦାର୍ଶନିକ ପରମ୍ପରାରେ ଯେ ଗୋଟେ କଥା ହଉଛି ଆତ୍ମକୈନ୍ଦ୍ରିକତା, ମାନେ ଆତ୍ମଟା ମୂଳରେ, ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ ହଉଛି ସମାଜ ମୂଳରେ। ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ଦୟାଜୀଙ୍କର ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ପ୍ରସ୍ତାବନା ସେଇ ସମ୍ପର୍କରେ ଦୟାଜୀଙ୍କର ଆଉ ଜଣେ ସମସାମୟିକ ଦାର୍ଶନିକ ତାଙ୍କ ନାମ ୟଶଦେବ ଶଲ୍ୟା, ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଦୟାଜୀଙ୍କର ଏଇ ଯୋଉ କଥାଟି ତାକୁ ଆହୁରି ଗଭୀରକୁ ଯିବାକୁ ପଡିବ। ଯେମିତି ପାଶ୍ଚାତ୍ୟ ଧାରାରେ କେମିତି ଆତ୍ମ ସହିତ ଯାତ୍ରା ରହିଛି ଏବଂ ଭାରତୀୟ ଧାରାରେ କେମିତି ସମାଜ ସଚେତନତା ରହିଛି ସେ କଥା କହିବାକୁ ଯାଇ ସେ ଲୋକ ସଂଗ୍ରହ କଥା କହୁଛନ୍ତି। ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ କଥା ରହିଛି ଯକ୍ଷ ଆଉ ଯୁଧିଷ୍ଠିରଙ୍କ ସମ୍ବନ୍ଧରେ ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଧର୍ମଟା ପ୍ରକୃତରେ କଣ, ମହାଜନ ଜନ ଗତସ ପନ୍ଥା। ଏଇଟା ବି ଆମ ଭିତରେ ଆମେ ବାଟ ଚାଲୁଛୁ, କିନ୍ତୁ ଆମ ଭିତରେ ଯୋଉମାନେ ମହାଜନ ଅଛନ୍ତି, ଯୋଉମାନେ ଅଧିକ ଅନୁଭବ କରିଛନ୍ତି ତାଙ୍କ ପଥ ଆମେ ଅନୁସରଣ କରିବା। ତେଣୁ ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ଅନୁସରଣଟା କେବଳ ଆତ୍ମ ଭିତରେ ସେଟା ବାନ୍ଧିକି ରହିନାହିଁ। ଆଉ ତୃତୀୟ କଥାଟି ହଉଛି ଋଣ। ଆମର ଯୋଉ ତିନୋଟି ଋଣ ରହିଛି, ଦେବତାଙ୍କୁ, ଆମର ପିତାମାତାଙ୍କୁ ଏବଂ ଏମିତି ଯୋଉ ତିନୋଟି ଋଣର କଥା। ଆଉ ଦୟା ଯେଠି କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଆମର କେବଳ ଋଣ ତିନି ପାଖକୁ ନେଇ ସମସ୍ତଙ୍କ ପାଖରେ ଆମେ ଋଣୀ। ଆଉ ତେଣୁ ଦୟାଜୀ ଆଉ ଶଲ୍ୟଙ୍କର ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ସମ୍ବାଦ ଭାରି ଗୁରୁତ୍ୱପୂର୍ଣ୍ଣ। ତାପରେ ଆଉ ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଦୟାଜୀଙ୍କର ଏଇ ସବୁ ପ୍ରଶ୍ନ ଭିତରେ ମୂଳ କଥାଟି ହଉଛି ଯେ ଭାରତୀୟ ଦର୍ଶନରେ କେତେ କେତେ ସବୁ ସୁନ୍ଦର ସୁନ୍ଦର ସବୁ କଥା କୁହାଯାଇଛି, କିନ୍ତୁ ଯେପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ବ୍ୟବହାର ସହିତ ସେଟା ସଂଯୁକ୍ତ ରହିଛି, ଯେପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ବ୍ୟବହାର ରୋଗଯୁକ୍ତ ହେଇଥିବ, ଆଉ ଯେପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ଆମେ ଆତ୍ମା ନାଁରେ ସମାଜ ଠାରୁ ଦୂରେଇ ଯିବା, ଗୋଟେ ପଳାୟନପନ୍ଥୀ ଆଧ୍ୟାତ୍ମିକତା, ସେଇଟା ହିଁ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଆମ ଭାରତୀୟ ସମାଜକୁ ଆଉ ଅବନତି ପଥରେ ଘେନି ଆସିଛି। ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ପଳାୟନ ପନ୍ଥା ଆତ୍ମକୈନ୍ଦ୍ରିକ ଆଧ୍ୟାତ୍ମିକତା ନାଁରେ ଯୋଉ ଗୋଟେ ପଳାୟନ, ତାର ଗୋଟେ ଆମୂଳଚୂଳ ସମୀକ୍ଷା, ମୂଳଭୂତ ସମୀକ୍ଷା ଦୟାଜୀ ଯାହା କରୁଛନ୍ତି, ସେଇ ସମୀକ୍ଷା ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇଙ୍କ ସମୀକ୍ଷା ସହିତ ଭାରି ସଂଯୁକ୍ତ ମଧ୍ୟ। ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ସବୁବେଳେ କହୁଥାନ୍ତି ଯେ କେମିତି ଆଧ୍ୟାତ୍ମିକତା ନାଁରେ, ଧର୍ମ ନାଁରେ ଆମେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ସମାଜକୁ ଛାଡ଼ି ପଳେଇ ଯାଇଛୁ। ସେ ପଳେଇ ଯିବା ଫଳରେ ଯୋଉ କଥା ଡାନିଏଲ କହୁଥିଲେ, ଯଦି ସମସ୍ତ ଯୋଉ ଆତ୍ମଜାଗ୍ରତ ଆତ୍ମା ମାନେ ଯଦି ଦୈନନ୍ଦିନ ବ୍ୟବହାର, ସାମାଜିକ ଅନୁଷ୍ଠାନ ତା ସହିତ ସଂଯୁକ୍ତ ନ ରହିବେ, ତାହେଲେ ଯୋଉମାନେ ଅନୈତିକ ମାନେ ସେମାନେ ନିଜର ସ୍ୱାର୍ଥ ପାଇଁ, ନିଜର କ୍ଷମତା ପାଇଁ ଏଇ ସବୁକୁ ବ୍ୟବହାର କରିବେ। ଠିକ ସେମିତି ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ପଳାୟନ ଦ୍ୱାରା ହିଁ ଆମେ ସମାଜକୁ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଦାନବ ମାନଙ୍କ ହାତରେ, ଦୁର୍ଦାନ୍ତ ମାନଙ୍କ ହାତରେ ଛାଡ଼ି ଦେଇଛୁ। So now dear Daniel, please.
Thank you, Ananta. Okay. So now I want to touch on Daya Krishna's second main project, the Samvad project. So I'm starting with three lines from 3 lines dedicated to Ananta the poet, from the Nigerian British poet Ben Okri. I'm quoting from his book, A Time for New Dreams. And Ben Okri writes, there is also intellectual hospitality. It's a poem called Hospitality. And he writes, there is also intellectual hospitality, the hospitality to ideas, to dreams, to ways of seeing, to perception, to cultures. This is the most important hospitality of all, and it includes all other hospitalities. And I'm starting with this quote from Ben Okri because I think that the notion, the concept, the practice of hospitality to ideas stands at the root of the Samvad project. The Samvad project was initiated by Daya Krishna in the 1980s with colleagues such as MP Rege, R.C. Dwivedi, and Mukund Lart. The idea behind the project, Daya Krishna explains in the preface of his book, Discussion and Debate in Indian Philosophy from 2004, was to bring together active practitioners, I'm quoting, quote, active practitioners of the two philosophical traditions, the Indian and the Western, in a dialogical situation where each was forced to existentially face the living tradition of a different way of philosophizing, unquote. Every phrase here is interesting. Active practitioners, dialogic situation, forced to existentially face living tradition, ways of philosophizing. This project or experiment, as Daya Krishna often refers to it, established a dialogue between pundits and philosophers, i.e., philosophers thinking and writing in Sanskrit, and their brothers and sisters trained in the parallel tradition of European or Western philosophy on a variety of philosophical topics, from issues in philosophy of language to philosophical exploration of the emotions. Now I have to be a little short. I can't read to you everything that I prepared. You understand the political dimension of a project such as the Samvad project. There are two groups of Indian philosophers. There are two groups of brothers and sisters living next door to each other. One is the academic philosophers trained in the university, thinking and writing in English. And the other one, just next door, is the group of the Pandits, thinking and writing and philosophizing in Sanskrit. Now, interestingly, these two group of neighbors hardly know anything about each other's work. And what Dayaji suggests is very simple. Let's open the door and go visit our neighbor and ask him what he's doing. Now you might think that this is simple, but there is an elephant in the room. It's not an elephant. There are 1 lakh elephants are sitting in the small room, and these 1 lakh elephants are called colonialism, right? So Dayaji is contributing to what we refer to today as decolonization. You know that owing to Macaulay and the British system of education, the Sanskrit philosophy, Sanskrit philosophizing has become perceived as something quote unquote lesser than quote unquote again real philosophy which is done in English. This is how the professors are viewing the Pandits. And the Pandits, of course, from the other side are viewing the professors as totally as people that totally gave up their own identity and totally took the ways of thinking of the British or the Europeans. So both groups are not really enthusiastic to join the Samvad. We are talking about a series of meetings that took place in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. The beautiful thing was Dayaji. The reason that the Pandits agreed to come is because they couldn't say no to Dayaji. The reasons that the professors agreed to come was because of Dayaji. I don't know if there is a figure today in Indian philosophy that is inspirational enough to take people to bring people out of their what we call today comfort zone, and this is exactly what Dayaji did. So I want to read to you two short paragraphs that I wrote on the Samvad meetings. You want to translate briefly, or you want me to read first the 2 paragraphs, Ananta?
Read and I will translate later.
Okay. So I'm writing the following. I spoke in detail on Daya Krishna's Samvad project. Of course, I didn't, but I was planning to talk in detail on the Samvad project. His dialogic meetings with the Pandits, the Sanskrit classicists, for the sake of establishing something new, his phrase, in Indian philosophy. But in fact, Daya Krishna's first Samvad took place much before the interactions with the Pandits. It was a dialogic brainstorming of thinkers from the Asian countries. What's the name of the institution in Pondicherry? Asian blossoming. So Daya Krishna was in a brainstorming, the dialogic brainstorming of thinkers from Asian countries, each rooted in his own cultural framework, in the endeavor of establishing something new in the social and economic domains post-independence after the British. It was an attempt for an early Brexit, if you wish, an inverted Brexit, not of the British from the European Union, but of the former colonies from British economy and more broadly, from British intervention in every aspect of their life. Simultaneously, it was an attempt of departing, or at least taking first steps in this direction, from quote unquote soulless thinking, and shadow mind, a phrase which I'm quoting from K.C. Bhattacharya, Krishnacharya Bhattacharya's famous manifesto, Swarajin Ideas, 1929. This samvad, this economic and social samvad, occurs on the pages of Daya Krishna's early work, Planning, Power, and Welfare, from 1959. It was a dialogue between Daya Krishna, then at the Department of Philosophy, Sagar University, and economists Vu Cuc Tuc of the University of Saigon, Vietnam, and Nurul Islam of the University of Dhaka, Bangladesh, then East Pakistan. It was an intra-Asian dialogue between three scholars from the non-West attempting to decolonize the concept of welfare. Daya Krishna's motto, when people gather together, something new emerges, captures the incentive behind this dialogue. But a dialogue is no easy task, especially when the participants belong not just to different countries and cultures, but even disciplines. Daya Krishna, the publisher of this early Samvad notes, I'm quoting the publisher, is not a professional economist. That may perhaps be the reason why he is able to approach the subject of welfare from a fresh angle, unquote. But what appealed to the publisher as fresh was not necessarily seen as such by the economists. Many years later, Daya Krishna would look back at his work in different areas of philosophy and remark that, quote, the questions that we asked them, specialists of different disciplines, here the economists, appeared both new and inconvenient. The advantage of the outsider, he further explains, and for him the philosopher is always necessarily an outsider, is that his inconvenient questions can work in the direction of quote unquote disrupting old frames, hence opening new horizons for thinking. In his Samvad with the economists, Daya Krishna inquires about the human person, the individual. He wants to know how the particular villager or urbanite, man and woman, participates or fits in or enjoys the fruits of the master game called economic development. He is further interested and works towards the clarification of the connection between welfare and concepts such as power and freedom. So this is one thing that I wanted to read to you about the Samvad project. The other paragraph or 2-3 paragraphs that I want to read are from a totally different Samvad, from the Samvad with the classicists, from the Samvad with the Sanskritists, from one of the Samvads with the Pandits. So I'm reading to you, or I'm telling you about one of Dayaji's final rounds of Samvads. This round opens with Daya Krishna's own paper, Vedanta in the First Millennium AD, the case study of a retrospective illusion imposed by the historiography of Indian philosophy. I will read to you the title again because I spoke too quickly. The title of his paper, the paper that opens the Samvad, is Vedanta in the First Millennium, the case study of a retrospective illusion imposed by the historiography of Indian philosophy. It's from 1996. Daya Krishna looks into, I'm telling you what he's doing in this paper. He looks into two bibliographies. I don't know if you're interested in bibliographies. When you read a book, do you check the bibliography? Daya Krishna is most interested in the bibliography. He starts to read from the bibliography. So he looks into two bibliographies which cover every philosophical text known to us in the history of Indian philosophy, prepared Ananta parallelly by two Pandits. Both of them are known to you. Pandit Karl Potter, the American philosopher, and Pandit Tangaswami Sharma from Madras University at the time. And he discovers that the first millennium is the millennium of Buddhism and Nyaya. You understand what he's doing? He takes two bibliographies created by two wonderful philosophers, Tangaswami Sharma, the Pandit in Madras, and Karl Potter, the volume, the bibliography volume of his Encyclopedia of Indian Philosophies. He checks what is happening and he counts texts. He's counting how many Vedanta texts in the first millennium, how many Buddhist texts in the first millennium, how many Jaina texts, how many, etc., etc. And he comes to realize that there are no Vedanta texts. What kind of a move is it? Are you the philosophers that are listening to me, are you counting texts? Daya Krishna is counting the texts and comes to realize that there is hardly any Vedanta in the first millennium, as against the picture projected by Vedanta scholars in the late 19th century and early 20th century that project Vedanta as the Indian philosophical school from the Upanishads onwards. Dayaji finds a gap, finds a stop in the first millennium. Now he writes to scholars of Vedanta and he wants to know. And this is what he writes to them. I'm writing, he submits his discovery before an ensemble of quote-unquote insiders of the Vedanta tradition, which claim for hegemony during this period, and wonders about the politics of history making and about the hands which write the narratives that we are so used to. We are used to this narrative that Vedanta is the darshana in India. There is practically no Vedanta in the first millennium, he writes, and the idea of its dominant presence is a superimposition by the historiography of Indian philosophy. The propounders of the theory of Adhyasa, namely the Vedantikas, have perhaps themselves imposed one on the history of philosophy in India. Now, a wonderful ensemble of Vedanta scholars come to answer Dayaji, and it's interesting, again, they are interested in a dialogue with him. They don't treat him just as an intruder, they treat him as a very intriguing intruder. And this ensemble includes, for example, Professor Suresh Chandra. He says Vedanta existed in the first millennium in the hearts of the believers, in the hearts of the believers. Now to this, and Dayaji replies to them. First he writes a paper, then they answer, and then he answers their answer. In the hearts of the believers, this is a different story altogether. If this is true, Dayaji has nothing to say about it. Dayaji is interested in philosophy, not in what takes place in the hearts of the believers. Our good friend Godavarish Mishra, perhaps known to you, tells Dayaji, you looked into these two bibliographies, but perhaps there were other texts that are missing, that are gone, that were not traced, neither by Tangaswami Sharma or by Karl Potter. Now Dayaji in reply says, if this is the case, of course my conclusion might be wrong, but this is he says this is just a hypothesis. There were other texts. And Godavarish Mishra assumes, as a strong Vedanta believer and scholar together, he believes that there must have been texts that are missing from us today. And then comes Professor Professor R. Balsubramanian. Now, I'm sure that you know, Ananta surely knows Professor R. Balsubramanian. We used to call him with great fear and admiration, Professor RB, right? R. Balsubramanian. So now comes Professor RB and answers Daya. Again, a clash of titans, just in the case of Daya and Shah before. So Professor RB says, okay, I'm not quoting him, but I'm depicting the debate between the two. I'm saying Daya is further challenged by R. Balsubramanian. First, it is interesting to notice that Balsubramanian uses the terms Vedanta and Advaita Vedanta, or simply Advaita interchangeably. For him, Vedanta is primarily Advaita Vedanta. Second, his critique of Daya Krishna focuses on the concept of adhyasa. Adhyas, yes? Dayaji said it is a superimposition on the history of India. So superimposition in Sanskrit, adhyasa. So Professor Arbi focuses on the concept of adhyas. He accuses Daya Krishna of using this term too loosely. And now you will see the beauty of this debate is that both of them are very convincing. Both of them are extremely convincing. What are we going to do with a debate that both sides are convincing? It tells Dayaji, you are using this term too loosely. If the framework is broken, he argues, and anyone can use any term, here adhyasa, in his own way, a meaningful dialogue cannot take place. If the exchange between Daya Krishna and the insiders is about historical hegemony, then Balsubramanian takes this hegemony debate in a new direction, concentrating on hegemony and language. The question is, what is legitimate or illegitimate in language? Or what amount of freedom is allowed when using a classical concept such as adhyasa? It is a question about context and framework, fidelity and transgression. The concept of adhyasa, Balsubramanian explains, is a matter of perceptual error and has nothing to do with historiography. Hence, Daya Krishna's remark in adhyasa imposed on the history of philosophy has no meaning. He implies that unless context and framework are kept, there is no common ground for mutual understanding. Daya Krishna's present concern is Vedanta in the first millennium, but he will come back to adhyasa in and out of context and to the philosophical implications of this concept in a separate article, a sort of appendix to the present Samvad title of his future paper that was not written as this Samvad was taking place. The title was later on, Can the Analysis of Adhyasa Ever Lead to an Advaitic Conclusion? Balsubramanian continues to attack Daya Krishna severely and refers to him as idol worshipper Ananta. Of the various idols, he writes, which Daya Krishna seems to worship, I told you it's a battle of titans, that of the number is very suspicious. We know that in politics, the strength of a view is dependent on the number of persons who support it. A particular view becomes dominant and prevails over others if its supporters are numerically in a majority. However, the politics of the number has no place in philosophy, tells Dayaji. This is a wonderful paragraph I'm writing. First, since Shankara, whose notion of adhyasa became the bone of contention between Professor Arbi and Daya Krishna, prefers the abstract Nirguna Brahman over the palpable Saguna deities. Hence, devalues idol worship, right? Shankara devalues idol worship. To call Daya Krishna an idol worshipper is to imply that he's an outsider to Shankara's philosophical framework. But that Krishna is not just an idol worshipper. He's an idol worshipper of the worst kind. His idol, according to Balasubramaniam, is the number, a master of rhetoric. Balasubramaniam accuses that Krishna for defiling the pure realm of philosophy and moreover spirituality with politics. The number belongs to politics, he writes, not to philosophy. Ouch, was my first response. But the whole discussion here is about the politics of ideas. Daya Krishna hints that owing to modern agendas, Neo-Vedanta imposes a picture of Indian philosophy which projects Vedanta as dominant from the very beginning, namely from the Upanishads onwards. Balasubramanian, a master of Vedanta, quotes from Shankara's commentary on the Taittiriya Upanishad, where he claims that, quote, a philosophical position cannot be considered to be sound just because a number of its votaries is legion, unquote, as Balasubramanian puts it. Moreover, metaphysically, Shankara anyway prefers the one over the many. But is it a convincing objection, I'm asking, to Daya Krishna's counting experiment and to his conclusion that the majority of texts in the historical period under discussion are not Vedantic? The prejudice for number is deep-rooted in human nature. Balasubramaniam continues to twist the knife. And Daya Krishna's argument in this case shows that he is a victim of the idola tribus. Balasubramaniam, we discover, is not just a first-class Sanskritist, but a frequent visitor in another classical language, Latin, idola tribus. The phrase idola tribus in capital letters refers to the idols of the tribe. That Krishna is lucky, I thought to myself, as I read Balasubramaniam, that he was not accused by his knowledgeable opponent of falling victim to the idolaphori, the idols of the marketplace. It is said of Moshe Sneh, an Israeli politician and member of the first Knesset, the Israeli parliament, that he wrote on the draft of one of his famous speeches, I'm quoting, "Weak argument, raise voice." My feeling is that the Latin phrase in capital letters works in the same way as raising one's voice. Balasubramanian opens the final paragraph of his response with the claim that, quote, the Vedantic thought of the Upanishads constitutes the philosophia perennis, which has endured through the ages, and closes this paragraph in the whole paper with his complementing claim. The Vedanta philosophy of the Upanishads is indeed the rock of ages, which one has to encounter and reckon with in doing philosophy. The phrase philosophia perennis and rock of the ages, again Latin and capital letters, surely convey the conviction of Balasubramaniam and the other insiders who participated in the Samvad about the significance of Vedanta philosophy and its essential texts. Balasubramaniam strives to place a firewall between the quote-unquote trusted insiders and the quote-unquote intruding questions of the outsider. No wonder then that Daya Krishna titled his reply to Balasubramaniam and the others, he wrote a final paper titled The Shock-Proof, Evidence-Proof, Argument-Proof World of Sampradayika Scholarship of Indian Philosophy. Again, I'm reading to you the title, The Shock-Proof, Evidence-Proof, Argument-Proof World of Sampradayika Scholarship of Indian Philosophy. He basically says, whatever I will say, whatever evidence I will bring, it will not convince you. You are so rooted in the tradition that you don't have the ears to listen to the question that I'm raising. Now, I have just one small thing and I'm closing and I'm finishing, Ananta. So just 5 more minutes and then I'm done. The last major project of Daya Krishna that I will not say anything to you about is the project of rereading classical texts in you. And we had an argument in the positive sense just a couple of weeks ago in another webinar, in another meeting for the release of Professor Pradhan's book on Daya Krishna, about Daya Krishna and postmodernism. Daya Krishna is a postmodern, and my argument is, I don't have the time to substantiate my argument, is that there is a postmodern strand in Dayaji's reading of classical text. Dayaji was definitely a modernist, which again, I cannot explain right now, but that postmodern feature, I want to say something very, very brief about. I'm quoting from an interview with Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, with Professor Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, an interview with this. I mean, she's interviewed by someone called Steve Paulsen. And she says the following, I'm quoting Gayatri Spivak. She tells him that part of deconstruction, which said, you do not accuse what you are deconstructing, you enter it. Remember that critical intimacy? And you locate a moment where the text teaches you how to turn it around and use it. Again, and you locate the moment where the text teaches you how to turn it around and use it. Spivak's articulation, Gayatri Spivak's articulation, especially the part of entering a text and locating, what I read to you already twice, locating a moment where the text teaches you how to turn it around, is for me an accurate description of Daya Krishna's project of rereading classical Indian sources anew, raising the unasked questions. But there is also the process of opening the text, in which one needs to confront authority, be it the authority of the text, the author, or the tradition that claims possession of the text, apropos the debate with Bal Subramania. Or as Spivak put it again, deconstruction simply questions the privileging of identity so that someone is believed to have the truth. It is constantly and persistently looking into how truths are produced. Spivak's articulation again captures Daya Krishna's working method, both in the sense of questioning the belief that someone is the holder or the owner of truth, and when she speaks of a persistent look into the politics of truth making. Thank you.
Toda Roba, Toda, for this not only grand finale, but intermediate finale. So bringing so many strands together indeed. And I'll just translate in 2 minutes. And then I realized that, dear Daniel, you requested for 1.5 hours, and we might touch.
But it is my fault. I went too long, yeah.
No. But with our mutual generosity, we'll try to, have 2 hours with us, another 20-25 minutes. So very quickly, let me translate. Amar bhai bhoni mane ei parjayare Daniel कहउचंती जे दयाजी जो संवादर कथाटी कहिचंती से संवाद जे केवल पंडित एवं दार्शनिक भितर नुहे आउ संवादटी आरंभ होइतबा आउ गुटे स्थानरू से 1960 दशक जेतेबेले आमे प्लानिंग रो कथा कहउथुलु अर्थनैतिक विकास कथा कहउथुलु प्रकृत रे अर्थनैतिक विकास कोन जनमंगल कोन से विषय दयाजी वियतनाम रो जने स्कॉलर एवं नूरुल हासन बांग्लादेश संगे कथाटी पकई एवं से जो एशिया रो लोक मान से संगलाप बड़ संगलाप द्वितीय संगलाप होउची जो पंडित आ दार्शनिक मान भितर ଏବଂ ଦୟାଜି ଗୋଟେ ଭାରି ବଡ଼ ପ୍ରଶ୍ନ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଆମେ ସମସ୍ତେ ଧରି ନଉଛୁ ଯେ ଭାରତୀୟ ଦର୍ଶନର ମୂଳରେ ବେଦାନ୍ତ। ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଆମର ଯେଉଁ ପ୍ରଥମ ମିଲିୟନିୟମରେ ଆମେ ଯେଉଁ କହୁଛୁ ଯେ 1 ଏଡିରୁ 1000 ଏଡି ପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ସେଇ ସମୟରେ ବେଦାନ୍ତ କ'ଣ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଆମର ଦାର୍ଶନିକ ପରମ୍ପରାର ମୂଳାଧାର ଥିଲା। ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ସେଇ ସମୟରେ ଯେତେ ସବୁ ଦର୍ଶନ ଗ୍ରନ୍ଥ ପ୍ରକାଶିତ ହେଇଛି ସେଇଥିରୁ ଜଣାପଡ଼ୁଛି ଯେ ସେତେବେଳେ ଅଧିକ ବୁଦ୍ଧ ସଂଯୁକ୍ତ ଦାର୍ଶନିକ ବିଚାରମାନ ଥିଲା, ସାଂଖ୍ୟ ସଂଯୁକ୍ତ, ଜୈନ ସଂଯୁକ୍ତ ଏବଂ ବେଦାନ୍ତ ଗ୍ରନ୍ଥ ସେତେ ବେଶୀ ନଥିଲା। ଏବଂ ଏଇ ଯେଉଁ କଥାଟିକୁ ବିଷୟରେ ଆଲୋଚନା କରିବାକୁ ଯାଇ ଆଉ ଆର୍ ବାଲସୁବ୍ରମଣ୍ୟ ସେ ବେଦାନ୍ତର ଜଣେ ବଡ଼ ପ୍ରବକ୍ତା ଏବଂ ଦାର୍ଶନିକ, ତା ସହିତ ଆମର ପରିଚିତ ଏବଂ ସମ୍ମାନନୀୟ ବନ୍ଧୁ ଏବଂ ଦର୍ଶନ ଅଧ୍ୟାପକ ପ୍ରଫେସର ଗଦାବରୀଶ ମିଶ୍ର, ଯାହାକୁ ବି ନିମନ୍ତ୍ରଣ କରିଥିଲେ ଆମ ସାଙ୍ଗରେ ଆଜି ଯୋଗ ଦେବାକୁ। ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଗୋଟେ ଦର୍ଶନର ଯେଉଁ ମହତ୍ଵ ସେଟା କେବଳ ସଂଖ୍ୟାରୁ ଜଣାପଡ଼େନି। ହୁଏତ ସେତେ ବେଶୀ ଦାର୍ଶନିକ ଗ୍ରନ୍ଥ ନଥାଇପାରେ ବା ଶିଶୁ ଦାର୍ଶନିକ ଗ୍ରନ୍ଥ ମାନ ଆମର ପରିଚିତ ନଥାଇପାରେ। ଆଉ ଏଇ ଗୋଟେ କଥାଟି, ଆଉ ତାପରେ ଶେଷ କଥାଟି ସେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଦୟାଜୀଙ୍କର ସବୁଠାରୁ ବଡ଼ ଅବଦାନ ହେଉଛି ଯେ ଆମ ଭିତରେ ଯେଉଁ ସବୁ କ୍ଲାସିକାଲ ଯେଉଁ ପରିଚିତ ଗ୍ରନ୍ଥ ମାନ ରହିଛି, ପରିଚିତ ପରମ୍ପରା ମାନ ରହିଛି, ବେଦ, ଉପନିଷଦ, ଋଗ୍ବେଦ, ତାକୁ ଆମେ କେମିତି ବର୍ତ୍ତମାନ ସମୟରେ କେମିତି ପଢ଼ିବା ଏବଂ ସେଇ ପଢ଼ିବାର ପ୍ରକ୍ରିୟାରେ ସେ ଯେଉଁମାନେ ଧରି ନେଇଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଆମେ ହିଁ ପଣ୍ଡିତ, ଆମେ ଯାହା ବ୍ୟାଖ୍ୟା କରିବୁ ତାହା ସତ୍ୟ, ତାକୁ ଦୟାକୃଷ୍ଣ ତାକୁ ପ୍ରଶ୍ନ କରିଛନ୍ତି ଏବଂ ସେଇ ପ୍ରଶ୍ନ କରିବାର ଧାରାରେ ସେଇ ହେଉଛନ୍ତି ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଗୋଟେ ଆଧୁନିକତାକୁ ସେ ଅତିକ୍ରମ କରୁଛନ୍ତି, ଯାହାକୁ ଆମେ ଉତ୍ତର ଆଧୁନିକ ବା ପୋଷ୍ଟ ମଡର୍ନ ବୋଲି କହୁଛୁ। ଗାୟତ୍ରୀ ଚକ୍ରବର୍ତ୍ତୀ ସ୍ପିବାକ ତାଙ୍କର ଏକ ସାକ୍ଷାତରେ କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ କଥାଟି କ'ଣ, ଯିଏ ମାନେ ଧରି ନେଇଛନ୍ତି ଯେ ଆମେ ସବୁ ବଡ଼ ପଣ୍ଡା, ଆମେ ଆକୁ ବ୍ୟାଖ୍ୟା କରିବା, ତାକୁ ହିଁ କ୍ୱେଶ୍ଚନ କରିବା, ତାକୁ ହିଁ ପ୍ରଶ୍ନ କରିଲେ ହିଁ ଯାଇ ଯେ ଶାସ୍ତ୍ର ଭିତରେ କ'ଣ ଅର୍ଥ ରହିଛି ଆମେ ତାକୁ ବୁଝିପାରିବା। So this is my brief translation. So dear friends,
I just want to add one last thing. I forgot to tell you the most important thing.
Okay.
That all of Daya Krishna's writings, all of them, 95% of Daya Krishna's writings in English and in Hindi, including audio lectures, are available online. Open access, ready to download if you wish, in a website called Daya Krishna, the Open Library. Just type Daya Krishna in Google and you will find the Open Library, and you are, of course, most invited to read him firsthand.
And one addition is that when you are opening the library, sing a song so that you will get the better meaning of Daya Krishna's thought. And also Daniel's thought. So now, dear friends, let us listen to our great Sufi and also wandering philosopher and friend, Dr. Muhammad Maroof Shah, please. Maroof.
It was really a delight to know Daniel Raveh's work, and in fact, great memories of Dayaji's great. He was a doyen of Indian philosophy and one of the great teachers. As Daniel said, he was a great mobilizer of souls, a gatherer of souls. He could inspire like none else. And we now miss Dayaji because we miss, I think, such central figures who could somehow inspire so many. And in fact, one of the finds of Dayaji was this: Daniel himself, he rescued a sadhu for philosophy. So I was reminded of how Socrates tried to get a student, and then he got Plato through dream and through the insight. And one of the great markers of great teachers is that able to cite their future continuators of their legacy. So the tribute Daniel is paying to Dayaji by writing a wonderful work on him. I read parts of it. So it shows Dayaji was right in picking up his, in a way, disciple, or in a way, fellow philosopher, I would say, Dayaji would not like to have a disciple, he would love to have a fellow philosopher with whom he would be in a dialogue. So in fact, this Daniel's book is an attempt to, in a way, put the Dayaji in dialogue with other major contemporary titans and other great figures on key debates. So I just want to, in response, in appreciation, or what we call in dialogue with now Daniel, Raveh, and Dayaji and all that, a few points I was just trying to note. So we know Dayaji enjoyed deflating, puncturing, questioning, going against the grain. Now, some key issues in Dayaji that Raveh brings especially for our notice. So wonderful introduction. He himself narrated many things of it. And then the whole work is the way one enters into the whole living realm of Indian philosophy. Now, for Dayaji especially, I think Bertrand Russell will also agree in a way. He has written an essay on it. Philosophy involves living the question. More importantly, I remember here Eric Vogelin, who is in a way able to, he's considered by some modern Plato, who has a great multi-volume works on political philosophy. Then Plato and Aristotle volume is wonderful. I think the point centrally he is raising that man is the question. So philosophy is an attempt to keep this question alive. And I would argue that mysticism, poetry, art, and religion, they share this interface with philosophy. They all, in a way, are different ways of keeping the question of transcendence alive, the question of seeking, the question of not getting, in a way, attached to any conceptual realm, any given state, the question of ever moving forward, not resting anywhere. In fact, I remember great Ibn Arabi, Muslim sage, who defines the Muhammadan station. He calls it the greatest station that is available to man. That he says is a station of no station. It means a station of perpetual traveling, not finding answers anywhere. One just moves. Even Iqbal, for example, I am recalling Hardam Javida, Hardam Rama Zindagi. Life never stops. So philosophy is trying to capture the essence of that life, that movement of that life. So philosophy is not about static answers, but about keeping the questions live. So I know Dayaji was so particular about what he called charcha karenge, dialogue. In fact, when he got invited me to Jaipur, the first sentence he began when I just greeted him, मैंने सोचा चर्चा करेंगे, because charcha is what keeps us alive. Now, if I think the most profound meditations of why dialogue is so central, we find that those in Kierkegaard. In fact, we know he builds on that Plato and all Socrates, but the point is the dialogue is readiness to be transformed by the other. So that is intellectual hospitality. And I think that is the key to what we call, how we define Sufism as openness to the other. Levinas, we know, would define ethics as openness to the other. And in fact, the whole philosophy has been in a way defined as opening to the being open to the other. Now, if this is so central to definition of philosophy, then like Dayaji embodied that philosopher, that figure of philosopher. He was so open to the other, and he loved to be in a way just to get other perspectives in focus. And in that sense, he is in a way characteristically postmodern. I would not call him a postmodernist in a very narrow ideological sense, that becomes abusive, but in the sense that to invite all perspectives, almost in that Sayad Vada in Jainism, we find maybeism, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let all intellectual currents coalesce and just converge, and then we move forward. And I was intriguing, why can't we have Dayaji's, the idea, for example, to which Daniel also referred, social and Atman centricity? Why can't we have a dialogue between these two things and then say, in fact, where they are polar opposites, not binaries. In a way, my point is, everywhere where Atman is central, it must show itself in radiating the good to the society. That's why we find great activistic mystics, prophets. So wherever Atman or the spirit is central. It informs in not only every socio-political sphere, but the whole aesthetic, the whole, I think, that's why when we really interrogate, for example, Jewish tradition, Islamic tradition, Christian tradition, and Indian traditions as well, we find not that no, it is nowhere that a recluse who abandons the world is in a way treasured. We find those are ultimately treasured who find God within, who are able to celebrate God in every phenomenon. So we know, for example, him Shankara himself. He moved a lot, he interacted with 10,000 groups and people. And then we find, for example, till Ramakrishna, till great Vedantists, I don't think they have in a way taken to the Asha. If you can take Maharishi, none of them took to jungle for the sake of taking to jungle. But only is, as we know in Christian tradition, a monk is a space. We go to the what we call this, where monks live. They just, as our that great modern Christian mystical philosopher explains it in his New Seeds of Contemplation, that he just refreshes himself to refresh the whole world. So Atman centricity and his social other commitments, they are not in a way contradicting each other. In great traditions, I know, for example, in Sufism, Khanka is a space where we feed the wayfarer. Everyone is open, everyone is invited. So Sufis have a culture of feeding the poor. So the Sufis, in a way, Sufism is defined by Sadi as serving the other. And one definition of Sufism is how better you are in a human relationship. That is the index of your spiritual progress. So to cultivate relationships is what Atman centricity in a way requires. So I think, and I was also just trying to think why consider Vedanta, the debate on Vedanta is, for example, this RB Subramanian, why can't we have both dialogue? Can't we have in a way invoke the notion of dialogue here as well and see RB and Daya Krishna agreeing in principle on the point that we need to talk. That let us not call Vedanta. We know that Dayaji brings huge wealth of evidence to show that Vedanta was not the central. Buddhism and other traditions were doing the where in a way more productive, more proliferating works are in those traditions. But I think we can agree with RB that Vedanta is the bedrock. But we know there are, for example, influential works by Guyunun and others who have argued that 6 systems of Indian philosophy should not be seen as opposites or alternatives who try to vie for or compete for a space, but they are different points of view. In great perennial philosophy, we find Buddhism and Vedanta. At a particular point, we are not able to find them too divergent. That was the whole argument of Kumaraswamy. Let us leave Radhakrishna. He tried to, in a way, Dayaji is right. He has rightly criticized him. In a way, he's too much colonized. He has tried to appropriate Indian and philosophy in Western terms. That is right. In fact, great perennialist writers have also taken Radhakrishnan to the task on this point. But I would just try to argue the point that we can somehow find Vedanta in dialogue with other Indian systems of philosophy. Even I would say so-called it is rivals, Buddhism and Jainism, not to speak of other Nyaya and other which are the Sikh Orthodox systems, which are considered points of views, not fundamentally differently, in a way, different things. So my point is, Dayaji, in dialogue with the others, we have no other perspectives with which we can appreciate both of them. We do not need to take either or position. We do not need to side with either RB or Dayaji. I think they are in a way articulating different, in their own ways, different points of view, and we can largely agree. We find, for example, Vedanta as a bedrock of truth being argued across by even Muslim philosophers, Muslim Sufis, who would be least expected to say in this tone, but then they identify whether with pure metaphysics. And then we know pure metaphysics is in a way implicit everywhere, though it is not in a way being engaged or brought into focus by some other systems. We, for example, Nia, it primarily focuses on logic. So it in a way brackets metaphysics, but that does not mean it in a way does away with it in a sense that it contradicts it. So these are things I just try to bring in. Now what Daniel tried to invoke Dayaji on some of these points, I was just trying to, but philosophy is moksha centric. Dayaji, we know, took a position against it. But I am again intrigued by the possibility of the way, for example, Dayaji defended empirical freedoms. He said they are more important. But when we closely examine moksha centricism itself, it is not in a way a beyond centricism. Moksha is always a moksha from attachment to a disworldlism. It is not fleeing from the world. It is not fleeing from a social and ethical responsibility. Moksha is in a way getting a perspective. For example, how Nagarjuna is able to say samsara is nirvana. For a nirvanic consciousness, this is possible to celebrate everything as participating in that great nirvanic paradise. So samsara is nirvana. So moksha centricism of Buddhism, for example, is not against celebration of great art and architecture. We know Buddhism produced one of the greatest civilizations, which celebrates beauty. Kumaraswamy has also noted this point. So my point is moksha centricism of Hindus, for example, of Vedanta is not against creating great artworks and celebrating life in all its forms. So how do we then find, for example, 4 stages of life, grihasti and vanprastha is last of them, but how do we then find all of these stages coexisting in a Vedantic outlook? So we see everyone is placed at what it should be placed in a way. For example, in Islamic understanding, when we define philosophy, we equate it with hikmah. We know philosophy, love of wisdom. Wisdom is hikmah. But then when we try to define what is wisdom, we define it is in the same way. It is basically putting things where they should be placed. That's precisely the definition of justice in Plato and elsewhere. Justice is giving everything it is due. So hikmah is giving moksha, it is due. Hikmah is giving empirical freedom, it is due. Hikmah is giving here and now, it is due. We know eternity is here and now. That is the claim of great mystics, including the Vedantists. So there you should be in a way closely in agreement with this key project that fundamentally we celebrate this life in the light of eternity. As for example, seeing subspecies eternities, all this. Then that's how we're able to see Wittgenstein in this mystical realm. So mystics do not invite us to another world. They invite us to look at this world from a transformed vision. For example, there's a famous dialogue regarding when Zen Buddhist monk was asked, what did he find the difference after this Satori, after Nirvana? He said, I just looked at this world, but with 1 foot above the ground. So we look at the same world in the here and now, celebrate all its trivialities, but we'll just fall in love with them. We find being in a way, we are attracted to the being, which is normally hidden in our conceptualism. Now I find invoking of the aesthetic in Dayaji very interesting. He was so much interested in this aesthetics, art. And when you closely examine that, we're able to bridge Dayaji when he tries to, in a way, East and West dichotomy is in a way trying to be bridged. With the help of aesthetics, we are able to get 2 realms together, the rational and the what we call supra-rational. When what is art fundamentally? Art is defamiliarizing the world. Art is looking at the world in a new way. Art is celebrating the trivial things. Joyce's whole Ulysses is basically about this, to find transcendence in the sensible. And we know that postmodern notion of sensible transcendental, for example. So immanence and transcendence are not opposites. In Ibn Arabi also we find in every experience we should be able to see God, and we should not be able to see anything without seeing God first. So there is nothing sacred, secular. All things are sacred. And so there is all secular things are at the base in a way where God clothes himself through them. God manifests through them. All is divine. So I think when we closely look at these points of view, we are able to see Dayaji is in a way continuing those old key debates, and he's just using certain new terminology. But then we find if it is if too much of binaries we read in them, then that will be a problem. Now I was just there was a debate between both Bhattu and Maududi on this purifying politics. For example, when this Zulfikar Ali Bhutto is said to have asked Sayyid Maududi why he is delving into this murky business of politics. You know, it is so dirty. But Maududi's response was brilliant. He said, do you want this dirty stream should be allowed to remain dirty? Why should not we purify it? So my point is the political is at the center of prophetic, mystical, activistic ethic. We must calibrate, in a way, redesign everything in the image of the divine norm. Why was Plato so much about laws? People normally forget his books on laws. They just read some dialogues. As Vogelin has argued that whenever we want to engage with the world with eye on the transcendence, eye on the divine, eye on the higher calling, we must try to then shape world in the figure of the divine nomos, the divine law. That is precisely the argument of revivalists. But then it degenerates into fundamentalistic ideologism. That's another problem. But the aspiration is this: to make everything into make everything as it should be, in the perfect image of the divine. It should celebrate its own blossoming. Let everything blossom. In fact, this is the key understanding according to Sufism of the practice of durood, which is sent on Prophet. When we send durood on Prophet, when we send blessings on Prophet, what we really do is we basically bless life. We bless whatever blesses life. This is the not only Asian blossoming, but the world blossoming. To bloom, to let bloom a small insect, a small flower, is what is in a way required from a mystic, from a religious person, from a believer. So I few points I was, Iqbal, we know, he said, Maghrib se ho bezar na mashriq se hazar kar, fitrat ka ishara hai har shab ko seher kar. Dayaji, we know, he in his Samvad project, he tried to distance it from a purely religious connotation. Now I was wondering how much, I know Professor Zafar tried to, he was asked by Dayaji he was given that questionnaire by Dayaji to give to the local imams in Kashmir for taking the Samvad with them. But when I closely examined that questionnaire, I found why our imams were silent. They didn't respond. I think they were not capable, mostly. And I think there was lack of intellectual hospitality on their part. So the tragedy is that we have not been able, this is considered one of the key melodies of modernity, of especially Muslims, that intellectuals and ulama have not been able to dialogue with each other. Our pundits and academicians are not able to dialogue with each other. We know Ananta Kumar Swami said the greatest problem that confronts modernity today is comparative religion, finding commonalities amongst religions. If we are able to do this, then we are able to come to a world peace. For example, we know the problem of Israel, for example, Palestine. One of the dimensions is the failure of interreligious dialogue between two Abrahamic communities. And we know, for example, in India, there are issues. So historically, the dialogue has not been allowed to blossom. We have not been able to, what we call, intellectually hospitable enough to the other, to the religious other, to our dialogic partner. That's why Daya Krishna is so important. India today, world today, nowhere we need so much this dialogic space, the hospitality for the other, than we need today. I invoke this Derrida's great essay on this hospitality, friendship. So all life is fundamentally trying to capture that. I think I should now, if time is gone, I will just try to invoke some Tagore's poems. For example, his Shish Lekha. The way Daniel tried to invoke poetry as well, and the some key notions of Dayaji. See what Tagore says. Life is sacred, I know, but its actual form I have never grasped. From some mysterious fountainhead, it breaks and travels down some wandering route I cannot trace. Now, we know mystery is inscrutable, and as Umar Khayyam would put it, myself and Young did eagerly frequent doctor and saint and heard great argument about it and above, but evermore came out by the same door as I went. Now, Hafiz made a similar point in his famous verse that none has been able to unlock the mystery at the heart of existence. Hikmat-e Umara, no one has been able to unlock this, the wisdom behind this world. Now, Tagore in another poem, wonderfully, he put, in a way, Dayaji would love to, in a way, invoke this in his key contention. Philosophy is open, being open to the question. Man himself is a big question. There is no logical route to solving the problem. Now, this is what Tagore says. The first day's sun asked the world's first emergence, who are you? There was no answer. Years passed. The last day's sun asked a final question. Near the shores of the western sea, amidst the silence of dusk, who are you? There was no answer. In Stray Birds, the theme of mystery crops up again. A few quotes will suffice. I will conclude on that. What language is thine, O sea? The language of eternal question. What language is thy answer, O sky? The language of eternal silence. Now, the key points regarding the great presentation of Daniel. I know he was one of the great students of Dayaji, favorite privileged students. In fact, Dayaji invested so much in him. He had great hope. I think he has lived up to that hope. Dayaji's spirit in another world must be happy to know that we are discussing his great work. And Daniel is in a way bringing his wonderful insights from across traditions to build up the case for why we need to be more open in this postmodern world for dialogue with the other, for more intellectual hospitality, more humility, and ultimately this East-West dichotomy should not bother us much. This rationalism is in the West and we are superstitious or supernaturalist. So these things are passé, and Dayaji helped us bring what we call Indian philosophy to the center stage, but with minus it to so-called moksha centricism. But we must appreciate it. He never denied moksha centricism in the essential sense in which moksha centricism implies fundamentally we affirm the mystery and sacrality of life, and then we celebrate every day and every here and now in the divine image. Thank you, sir, so much. I think I conclude. Time is over.
Time is never over because with Maroof, we live with eternity. and not only Dayaji is happy with the co-presence of fellow philosopher Daniel, but Dayaji is also smiling with the in that indescribable co-presence of Maroof. But time is also knocking at our door. I know Daniel, Daniel, is it okay to have another 10 minutes or so? Or if you are pressed for time, then is it okay, Daniel?
Yeah, it's okay, but let's make it 10 minutes. Yeah.
Yes, please. Yes. So now it is in that spirit. Let us hear a few more thoughts quickly. I request friends to share their thoughts because of the dance of time with us. First, Gyan Luigi.
Yes. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I hope yes.
Yes, please.
Well, of course, it was wonderful. Both the contribution were wonderful. I would have so much to say. Well, synthetically, I would say this, that the question of the separation or opposition between Atman-centric and social-centric as in my opinion, could, in my opinion, be discussed on the basis of some concept of Plato, and I would like to investigate on Daya Krishna in order to see what he is saying on Plato specifically, because in my opinion, Plato, and not only Plato, but in Plato, we have a sort of conjunction of joining between Indian tradition and ancient Greek heritage. If we think, for instance, if we take into consideration the similarities and the analogies which are present between the myth of the chariots and the failures, and on the other hand, the, the, the symbolic image of the self in the Katha Upanishad 3.3, we can find so many similarities, which, in my opinion, cannot be simple accident. There is something more than this, and I think that the Indian cultural heritage can be useful to us in order to understand that in Plato too, the perspective on the individual is that of an individual who is transcendent the social dimension. That is, and with Plato, then the Platonic tradition is a tradition which can extend also to the Rosicrucianism and to the Philosophia Perennis and to the Prisca Theologia in the Renaissance. There is a component in the Western philosophy which insists on the individuals not being simply a social-centric individuality entity, but on being a transcending entity, not an ethnocentric entity, not so strictly, but anyway, an entity which is not to be reduced to the social component. On the other hand, I would say that the separation between Atman-centric and social-centric is one that perhaps can be dismissed on the basis of some of Gandhiji's meditations, when he says, for instance, that the Atman belonging to every one of us is the fundament, the foundation of the sociality, that is that the society, which is right and just and morally correct, cannot be founded unless we acknowledge our Atman-based origin. Then this is a way in which the social aspect of the individual are to be reconduced to the original root of Atman, and the other way around, from the acknowledgement, the recognition of the Atman belonging of every one of us, can a just society be founded and be discovered and can have its foundation. Well, thank you very much. I leave it here. Thank you. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Gian Luigi. Lovely. So now, Dr. Shukla Chatterjee, please. Shukla Di. Shukla Di, you can unmute and share your thought. Okay, Shukla Di is taking some time. Dr. Alok Tandon, please. Alok Bhai.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. I was not expected to comment, but listening to Raveh and the second one, Dr. Maroof, now I just want to study Professor Daya Krishna more, because I am a bit confused by both the presentations. Because Professor Daya Krishna, I agree, was one of the persons who inspired me a lot. And because of one of those, I being a non-professional, I make rounds in philosophical circles. but the need for questioning is great. But my concern here is, was Daya Krishna looking at the things the way Maroof is talking about as something sacred, divine? What was the metaphysical stance of Daya Krishna? This is now a confusion before me, and I don't know. The presentation of Raveh was very informative for me, but on these issues I am not very clear. And one more thing I would like to say, that first time when I read that social philosophy past and present, uh, that was a great insight for me to look into the cultural predicament of at least our society. I'm not very much aware of the Western culture, that there are so many West and there are so many ancient and present, maybe sociocentric or atmocentric. But the argument between Shalyaji and and with Dayaji, I think Dayaji's arguments are superior. And the argument which brings Gandhi into the picture, I think Gandhi cannot be seen totally in that Vedantic tradition. Gandhi has got the influence of both the Indian as well as Western tradition. So Gandhi is very confusing in the sense that he has synthesized both the traditions. And to give the example of Gandhi in support of Vedanta, I think this gives us a very misplaced argument. So I would like Professor Raveh to point out these some of the things which is confusing me now, because I liked, but both the presentations are somewhat, I feel, at odds with each other. Was Daya Krishna a mystic, a follower of mysticism? I have got many doubts of myself. Thank you.
So thank you, Alok. Thank you. Now the our dance of thinking is warming up. That is so beautiful, but we have little time. And finally, our dear Randhir.
Thank you so much. And it is very interesting to listen Professor Daniel. I'm not a reader of Daya Krishna, but if we see the history of philosophy, has been a recurrent advocacy and a repudiation of transcendence, that is of God, that is numbers, of universe, of an otherworldliness beyond. Metaphysics, for example, raises questions about the empirical world which cannot be answered empirically. So we have to find how, or I would like to know from Daniel, like how Krishna answer this question, like why is there a universe, why am I me, why is being, is there life after death? But I can relate, a kind of Daya Krishna is more close to Buddhist, because in Buddhism there is no concept of teacher, right? So and a student is the first task of teacher. I think a studentship is the first task of teacher. That is the whole understanding of Daya Krishna, because if there is, if I say that, if Nietzsche say to do is to be, Kant say to be is to do, Sartre say do be, do, then Daya Krishna would say to be or not to be or not to be. So when you understand his conception of freedom, I find this illustration. So I think he is totally a non-ideological thinker. Is totally because if all ideology lead some sort of fundamentalism and dogmatism, and with this understanding, I would maybe it is my intellectual guess. It is he is more close to Buddha, self-conscious. Yes.
So lovely, dear Randhir. So now, Daniel, please.
Okay, so first I want to thank the listeners and of course the speakers. It was wonderful to see and to listen to Maroof Bhai after a very, very long time. And it was also wonderful to see and to listen to Alok Bhai after ages. I don't know if you remember that we met, I think, last in Surat. How many years passed?
I remember
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
I remember it very well.
And meeting you was instrumental for the Daya Krishna website, because you told me without the materials in Hindi it is useless. So immediately we added the Hindi section only because of your remark that night in Surat. So I'm thankful to you for this.
Thank you very much for remembering me. Very kind. Thank you.
So regarding the few points that were raised here, actually it is my fault. I should have been shorter and left more time to questions and comments. So I'm starting with Alok Bhai. Alok Bhai said, I'm confused. So I think that for Dayaji, confusion is the right state of mind for philosophizing. I mean, if you're confused, you're open to different views, to different options. And so we were successful to some extent, if you're saying that you're confused. Secondly, regarding the Dayaji Shalaji Samvad, we are using the word Samvad, right? We are not using the word Vad or Vada in Sanskrit. Vada is a matter of who is winning the debate. If I'm winning the debate in King Janak's court, I'm receiving 1,000 cows with I don't know, decorated with gold. If I'm losing, my head might be cut off, right? I'm thinking again of the third chapter of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So this is a Vada. This is not a Samvada. Samvada is a matter of collaboration. So I think that someone like Shalaji was instrumental for Dayaji's development of thinking in the same way that Dayaji was instrumental for Shalaji's development of thinking. And don't forget that these two figures were the founding editors. Actually, Dayaji was not the founding editor. He was the editor so many years that we might mistake him for a founding editor of the GICPR. D.P. Chattopadhyay was, of course, the founding editor. And Shalaji was the founding editor with Mukund Lat of Unmilan, the famous and one of the only journal of philosophy in Hindi. And Dayaji was contributing usually to Shalaji, and Shalaji was contributing to Dayaji. So I think that the question is not which position is, to quote you, superior, but to see what is coming up in the discussion. And I think that Shalaji's points are interesting. To think of Gandhi and Socrates together is very interesting, but also the method of philosophizing is interesting. The question is, how do I refute my opponent's position? And as I tried to suggest here, Shalaji is going, I refer to it as stitch by stitch. If Dayaji is reading text A, Shalaji is going and reads text A after Dayaji and discusses within this text. So I think that regarding which position wins, who's getting the cows, I think that the cows are shared at the end of the Samvad. Okay, now the question about mysticism. Was Dayaji a mystic? Apropos Maroof Bhai's short presentation. my task, the task that I took upon my shoulders in my book and here today, is not to be Dayaji's advocate, not to tell you what Dayaji says, not to defend what Dayaji says, but to invite you to read Dayaji. Therefore, I said the most important thing in my whole talk was referring you to the website where you can listen and read Dayaji firsthand. Was Dayaji a mystic? I don't know. I think that definitely Dayaji emphasized freedoms with the plural S in the here and now, but Maroof so beautifully connected the here and now to a sense of a beyond. If you read my book, you will see that I'm creating another discussion, another samvad between a younger Dayaji and an older Dayaji. Dayaji in a paper from the 1950s or early 60s, which is titled an analysis of the concept of freedom, and later papers of Dayaji. I think that the Dayaji, at least the later Dayaji, was stressing, emphasizing the here and now. Dayaji felt that any discussion of spirituality cannot come at the expense of what is happening here and now. And he was extremely concerned about the society and polity of India of his time. And I want to appreciate Maroof Shah's emphasis on Dayaji's openness. I think that this openness is something unique. We all talk about openness. Let's start a new political party in India to go in the next elections in 2024. Let's call it the Openness Party. Everybody is willing to vote for openness, but as a slogan, as a fig leaf, which covers other things. So I think that Dayaji's openness was not a slogan. Dayaji's openness was genuine, and this was one of the things that gave him power. People felt that he was really listening to them. And finally Randhir, that was trying to map Dayaji. Was Dayaji a philosopher of ideology? I agree with you. I don't think that he was. I think that the most important thing in Dayaji was not his philosophy, but the way he philosophized. I will close by mentioning another meeting, 2006, Delhi, the World Philosophy Congress. Dayaji meets a Japanese scholar of Indian philosophy that you might know, Sengaku Maeda, a scholar of Vedanta, a wonderful scholar of Vedanta, translator, a thinker. So Maeda and Dayaji meet, and Maeda, and both of them read each other's books, which is interesting, because in this sense they are not meeting for the first time. They are meeting in person for the first time after knowing each other's work for such a long time. And Maeda said to Dayaji, we stood there at it was in Delhi University, and these two people are talking, and 100 people are standing around trying to hear what's happening in this summit meeting. And Maeda asked Dayaji, I was taller, so I could hear better. So Dayaji, so Maeda asked Dayaji, so can you summarize your philosophy in one sentence? And Dayaji was in response, Dayaji was laughing and he said, we are thinking. Now this sentence, we are thinking, it was not this we, this majestic we, I'm the queen, I'm the king. It was we are thinking. And this we included Shalaji, and it included the Mukundlad, and it included Maroof Shah, and it included the Ananta Giri, and it included anyone that was willing, that was curious to think together with Dayaji. With Dayaji, sometimes we have these academic meetings which are very exclusive. Not everyone is invited. In Dayaji's case, everyone were invited. And if the room was not big enough, we used to move to a bigger room. So I think that I will close with this sentence, which is also an invitation. We are thinking, and our thinking does not stop at any conclusion, does not stop at, I don't know, 4 p.m. Israel time, which is right now. This thinking is perennial.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Seeing
So
you
just-
after a long time.
And just one linking line here is that one of the last essays of Dayaji is on Rig Veda. And then he's walking and meditating with this theme, the last theme in Rig Veda, Sam Gachadvam, Sam Badadvam. And then he's just writing that the God that is invoked here is the God of togetherness. And that is the future God. So I think these are the lines in which, we have ways of working and meditating with Dayaji, where we are thinking is also part of many other related movements of being and coping. So
thank you so much. Thank you so much. And see you soon, I hope. Bye-bye.
Yes, and we have just one line of a vote of thanks, Randhir.
Yes.
Is
Yes,
Devendra
yes.
co-present today?
Devendra is not co-present today, but no problem, I can. So
Okay. Very
all
brief
respected, all respected participants, thank you for being with us and meditating together. And we hope you all have very, very insightful evening. On behalf of organizing committee, I, Randhir, Gautam, we welcome and very, very grateful to all of you, particularly Dr. Daniel for his excellent and valuable information he shared with us. We are very grateful presence of our discussant, Dr. Mahfouz, Maroof Sahab, A.K. Tanan Sahab, Sri A.K. Tanan, and Professor Gyan Guli from Italy, and all dear friends. And I also feel very grateful to Professor Anand Kumar Giri to nurturing this talk and managing everything behind the scheme and our. Thank you so much. Thank you.